Hello. Good to see a good crowd out there today. Hope everyone is well. My name is Neil Witte, and you are sitting in on a certified beer server prep talk through the Cicerone certification program. So we are doing a series of these. This is the fourth one in the series. This one today is on the brewing process. So this is a 12-session series of informational videos designed to help you boost your beer knowledge and also to help you prepare for taking and passing the Certified Beer Server exam. That's our level 1 exam of the Cicerone certification program. So if you joined in the last session, it was on hop and fermentation flavors. Thank you for coming. If you missed it, you can find a link to that on our YouTube channel. We're going to be continuing to post these as they're completed. They'll live on the YouTube channel for you to view, so you can see all the ones I've done so far. These take place every Tuesday and Thursday at 1 p.m. Central Time. And we're doing this for 6 weeks. So we're going to do 12 total sessions. The last one will be on May 28th. So continue to tune in. We've had a good crowd for all these, and it's good to see. Lots of engagement. Lots of great questions at the end, too. So keep tuning in. One of the things that we're doing along with this is we're assembling a handful of review questions that go with each talk. So right now, on our blog at the cicerone.org website, you'll find a series of questions that are designed to go along with this talk. So they're questions you can use to either quiz yourself later on afterwards as a study guide, or to quiz your friends, or to kind of follow along with as I'm talking, so you can find the answers to them. So we don't have the answers posted to today's, but we do have the answers posted to the last one. So the last questions we put up for the talk I did on Tuesday, those are posted right now at that blog. So there's a link below that you can click to get to that blog. Or if you just navigate to cicerone.org and click on the blog link at the top of the main page, you'll get there as well. So click on that link, go check out the questions, and follow along. And we're going to post the answers to those questions at the beginning of my next talk, which is next Tuesday. So that's a little bit about that. So go ahead and check those out. Questions and answers, again, posted today for last Tuesdays, and the new questions for today's talk are posted right now as well. We'll post those answers on Tuesday. So while you're at the blog, there's a bunch of cool blog entries there to read, some good content there. If you want to explore other cool content, check out the rest of the Cicerone YouTube channel. Click subscribe and check out everything we've got to offer. There's a bunch of good information there for you. So another cool thing we're doing with this is we are giving away 10 certified beer server exams during each session. So we've already given away 30 exams so far. I've had 3 sessions, and we've already given away 30 exams total. So we're going to be giving away 10 more certified beer server exams today. So the way you get entered is at the end of my main talk, at the beginning of the question and answer session, there's going to be a link posted to a questionnaire. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to click on that link and go to the questionnaire and fill it out, and that will enter you for a chance to win one of those certified beer server exams. That will enter you, and hopefully you'll win. So since the prize is a certified beer server exam, we ask that if you are already a certified beer server, if you've taken and passed that exam already, please don't enter. Leave those exams for people who still need to take and pass that exam. And if you've already won one before, if you're one of those 30 people who have already won, please don't enter this time as well, because you're already disqualified. You can't enter twice, unfortunately. So apologies there. So I'm going to announce the last winners, the winners from the last time. First names only. We don't want to out anybody in front of you know, hundreds of people on social media here, but I will say if you hear your first name here, there's a good chance you're a winner. So the winners from last time are Christine, Jackie, Hector, Jameson, Eugene, Laura, Sonsarai, Brian, Simon, and Brian. So we have Brian with a Y and Brian with an I. All right, so congratulations to everybody who has won. And again, look for that questionnaire at the end of the session, at the beginning of the question and answer session. Look for that link to the questionnaire to enter to win a certified beer server exam. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about the brewing process. So I feel like I should mention right at the top here. So this is Certified Beer Server, or CBS, Prep Talks. But I feel obligated to mention that even though we're talking about brewing process here, brewing process is not covered on the Certified Beer Server exam. So you might be wondering, why are we even talking about this then if you're not going to test me on this? If you're sitting in and you're preparing for the Certified Beer Server exam, you're not going to be asked questions specifically about the brewing process. But understanding the brewing process is a good thing to know for kind of a holistic understanding of beer in general. There's a lot of questions that pop up in beer, and there are questions on the Certified Beer Server exam that it help to get a full understanding of those topics. It does help to understand certain steps in the brewing process, and to have a general picture of what's happening in the brewing process is very helpful when studying beer. So even though we don't have questions in the Certified Beer Server exam, we're going to talk about the brewing process today. And I think you might find this interesting, and you'll find this helpful as you continue your studies. So when we look at the brewing process in general, the big picture, we divide up the brewing process into really two basic phases, so to speak. We've got the hot side and the cold side. Simply put, the hot side's hot and the cold side's not, right? But really, the hot side, what we're generally trying to do on the hot side is we're teasing sugars out of malt and the barley malt. We talked about malt the other day. We're teasing sugars out of malt, and we're creating a sweet liquid that we call wort. That's W-O-R-T. You'll hear me use that a couple times today. So that's what's happening on the hot side. And on the cold side, we're converting that wort to beer through fermentation. And then we're polishing up some of the finer points of that and putting it in a package. So that's the big picture of what's happening. So let's talk individually about the certain steps, about the individual steps of the brewing process, so we have a little clearer understanding of how we're doing this. The whole thing starts with milling. So what we do is we weigh out all of the different roasts of barley malt that we are using for a particular batch of beer, depending on whatever the recipe might be. We take all that grain for one batch of beer and we run it through a mill. And the mill cracks open the grain and exposes the inside. Ideally, we're doing that to a point where the inside is exposed, but the husk of the grain is still left intact, because that can help us later on in the brewing process. So that's our goal, is to just expose the insides. That's milling. So the end product of milling is what we call grist. So that's the cracked malt. So we take that grist and we mix it together in the mash tun. So this is the next step of the brewing process. It's called mashing. So in the mash tun, we mix hot water with the grist, that cracked grain, And when the temperature is just right and the pH is right and all the conditions are right in that mash tun, the starch in the grain will turn into sugar. It breaks down into sugars. So we're extracting sugars from the malt. At the same time, we're extracting color and flavor compounds from the malt as well. If you listen to the talk, or if you sat in on the talk the other day about malt, you remember we talked about not just getting sugars from the malt, but flavor compounds and color as well, because this is where the color in beer comes from. And malt flavor is such a huge part of beer as well. So in the mashing process, this is where we're extracting all those things from the grain. So at the end of the mashing process, we have this sweet liquid. That's what we call wort again. We have the sweet liquid mixed up with a bunch of cracked grain. So the next logical step is to separate those two. We want to collect that sweet liquid and get rid of the grain. So we do that in a process called lautering. Lautering is done in a very specialized vessel. So the vessel, I like to think of it like a colander or a sieve, as the vessel has collection pipes coming from the bottom, and it's fitted with a set of screens at the bottom of the vessel. So what that allows us to do is to, when we have the mash sitting in the lauter tun, we can drain that liquid and leave the grain behind. So this vessel in small breweries is sometimes the same vessel as the mash tun. The mash tun might be fitted with those special screens at the bottom. In larger breweries, the lauter tun might be a different vessel from the mash tun. So regardless, in the lauter tun, we're separating that wort from the grain. We're draining that liquid, leaving the grain behind. And then there's rinsers that are placed inside that vessel that we can turn on hot water and rinse the grains and extract even more sugars and collect that from the bottom of the vessel as well. So once we're done, we've got all that sweet liquid collected, the wort, and it's separated from the grain, and then we can get rid of that spent grain. So the next step is to bring all of that liquid to a boil. So we've collected the wort in the wort kettle and we boil it. Boiling achieves a lot of different objectives for us. So for one, it sterilizes the wort. So any type of microorganisms that might be living in there are killed. Another important thing that happens is it volatilizes certain aromas that we don't really want. One in particular is called DMS, or dimethyl sulfide. That kind of smells like cooked corn or creamed corn. And if you don't boil vigorously, if you don't get a good vigorous boil, you'll end up with DMS in your beer. But if you do boil vigorously, that DMS volatilizes and it kind of just goes away. So that's another important aspect of boiling. Some styles of beer require an extended boil. And what that does is it caramelizes sugars and creates a richer malt flavor. Another thing that happens in the boil is that proteins will glob together. They coagulate. And so that's an important thing to happen for the next phase in the whirlpool, where those things will settle out. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is maybe one of the most important things that happens in the boil, and this is where we traditionally add hops. So hops are added during the boil to achieve a couple of different things. So we talked about hops the other day, and I mentioned this, but hops added to the beginning of the boil are boiled for an extended period of time, and those hops add bitterness to beer. So inside the hops are alpha acid resins. These resins need to be boiled to give bitterness to beer. So we put hops in at the beginning of the boil them for an extended period of time, and that's where the bitterness in beer comes from. Traditionally, hops are also added at the end of the boil, and those are added for more of their aroma and flavor characteristics. So those aromas and flavors come from the essential oils in hops. And so we add those at the very end of the boil, because if we boil aroma and flavor hops for too long, we'll extract those oils, but then the aromas boil away. We don't want that to happen. So we put hops in at the beginning for bitterness and at the end for aroma and flavor. So hops, as an aside, and I'll mention this at a couple other points in the process, hops for aroma and flavor can be added at different points in the brewing process, not just in the boil. Now, hops added for bitterness have to be boiled, but not some hops added for aroma and flavor do not have to be boiled necessarily. So I'll mention a couple other steps in the process where hops can be added to add aroma and flavor. So once we're done boiling, boiling might take place for an hour, hour and a half is about typical for most breweries. Then we go into a whirlpool process. So whirlpool is done for small breweries. Whirlpooling might be done in the kettle. For larger breweries, the whirlpool is a separate vessel. Regardless, the whirlpool gets the wort spinning. So in a separate vessel, as the wort is transferred from the kettle into the whirlpool, it fills from the side. So in a round vessel, it's spinning. The wort is spinning around as it's filling. And then once the vessel is full, the brewer allows that spinning to settle down. And once that spinning subsides, all of the solid matter that's in the wort will collect in the middle of the vessel. So that's all the stuff that collects there, that solid matter, is what we call trube. So the trube is made up of some grain matter. It could be hop matter as well, especially if you're using pelletized hops. But the majority of what's in the trube are those coagulated proteins from the boil that I mentioned earlier. So all of those things we want to separate from the wort before we move it on to the next phase. So the way I like to think about the whirlpool process is if you have a cup of tea with tea leaves in it. And if you stir your cup of tea, the tea leaves will collect in the middle of your cup. That's the same thing that's happening in the whirlpool. So once that whirlpool is done, then we can transfer relatively clear wort from the side of the vessel and send that to fermentation and leaving that trube cake behind. So this is really the end of the hot side. Altogether, the hot side can last, on average, anywhere from 5 to 7 hours. Could potentially be more or less depending on the brewery and the batch of beer and some other factors. So when whirlpool is done, we're transferring to fermentation. But it's really important to remember that in the whirlpool, the wort is still really hot. It's boiling hot still. So we want to cool it down very quickly, because one of the things we're going to do is we're going to pitch yeast into the wort. The yeast is going to do the work of fermentation. Well, yeast is a living organism, and it'll die if you put it in a boiling hot liquid. And it has a sweet spot for fermentation, for temperature. So we want to cool it down very quickly to fermentation temperature. We do that through a heat exchanger. Can be designed in a few different ways, but the heat exchanger uses cold water and sometimes glycol, coolant, to artificially cool the wort down fairly quickly. So after it comes out of the heat exchanger, it gets a little injection of oxygen. So it gets a pure source of oxygen injected into the wort on the way to fermentation. This oxygen is really important because the oxygen is food for yeast, and that helps to fuel the work of fermentation. So once the wort enters into the vessel, it has the yeast introduced to it, and the yeast goes to work consuming that oxygen that we entered in. That's the first stage of fermentation. The yeast consumes oxygen, and it builds cell walls, and it multiplies many times over. And when the oxygen is gone, then the yeast turns its attention to sugar, and it eats sugar. It eats the sugars, and it creates alcohol, it creates CO2, and if it's an ale yeast, it will produce a lot of aromatic fruity esters, like we talked about the other day. And certain strains of yeast might produce other aromatic compounds like phenols. We talked about those spicy characteristics. And there's a whole host of other aromatic compounds that yeast can produce as well. So all of this is happening during fermentation. So once those sugars are depleted, then it goes into the maturation phase. So in the maturation phase, the yeast is now cleaning up certain off flavors, and it's taking up different compounds that can make the beer taste unpleasant. So lager beers will undergo an extended maturation period. So that's a process called lagering. So that's really, lager means to store. So that's where that term comes from. So in the maturation phase is where hops can also be introduced. I mentioned before I would mention those times when hops could be introduced other than in the kettle. So some brewers will add hops during the maturation phase or at the end of the maturation phase. And this is a process called dry hopping. So when you add hops to the fermenter, you extract oils that give aroma and flavor, but you're not boiling, so you don't have any risk of those aromas boiling away. So what you end up with is a big, fresh, concentrated hop aroma and flavor. I didn't mention before during Whirlpool that some brewers will actually add hops to the Whirlpool as well. So earlier on, before fermentation. So that's another step. So we can add aroma hops at the end of the boil. We can add aroma hops in the Whirlpool. We can add aroma hops in the fermenter. And then the fermenter is where you get the most concentrated and really kind of the most powerful aromas and flavors added to the beer. Because it's not hot, there's no risk of them volatilizing away. So this dry hopping has become a very common practice in modern brewing, especially with American craft brewers. And it's almost an essential step for producing beers like American IPA. American IPA features big, fresh hop aromas, and then this is one of the best ways to get that. So after the maturation phase, we need to clarify the beer somehow. So this is separating, at a minimum, separating the yeast from the beer, and most of the time separating proteins from the beer. So even hazy beers undergo some type of clarification. So this could be filtration with paper pads, where we're forcing the beer through giant paper pads in a big plate and frame filter. It could be running the beer through a centrifuge and spinning the solids out. It could be utilizing what we call finings. Finings are different compounds that we can add to the beer which help the solids to naturally settle out. So regardless of what method is being used, there's some type of clarification taking place. And again, with hazy beers, that's often, more often than not, a protein haze that's being left behind. The yeast is still separated in some manner. So that could be with some type of filtration or centrifuge or some type of finings. So after clarification, we want to carbonate the beer. Now there's a good chance the brewer has already allowed the beer to naturally carbonate during fermentation. Because you remember, during fermentation, CO2 is being produced. And during the first stages of fermentation, the brewer allows it to escape from the vessel. It blows off the top and usually down a tube coming down a pipe coming down the side of the fermenter. So that CO2 is allowed to escape at first, but then partway through fermentation, the brewer will then close off the tank and allow that tank to build pressure. So the fermentation is still continuing, CO2 is still being produced, only now it's under pressure and it doesn't have anywhere to go. So it absorbs back into the beer and naturally carbonates the beer. So this is oftentimes a very imperfect process. So brewers dial in carbonation level very specifically in beers. They want to be pretty exact about it. And natural carbonation can be a not so exact thing. So oftentimes, even if the beer has undergone natural carbonation, it's at this point, after the clarification step, it has carbonation adjusted artificially. It's forced carbonated with tanks of CO2. So some brewers don't naturally carbonate their beer at all, and all of the carbonation comes from forced carbonation. So regardless, at this point, we're adjusting carbonation to where it needs to be. The next step is pasteurization and packaging. So pasteurization is not a process that every brewer undergoes. Pasteurization is the process of heating the beer up to a really hot temperature for a very short period of time. And what that does is it kills any microorganisms that may be living in there that could potentially spoil the beer later on. So it's kind of an insurance policy against spoilage. Most big domestic brewers pasteurize their bottles and their cans, but not their kegs. Most imported beers are all pasteurized, both bottle, can, and keg. And most craft brewers don't pasteurize at all. Although there are some larger craft breweries that pasteurize only certain beers that are at high risk of infection. So those could be, for example, barrel-aged beers that they don't want to have any microbiological spoilage. They might also do it to beers that have unusual ingredients added post-fermentation, like coffee or chocolate. Those beers are at high risk of contamination from some type of microorganism. So you might see some larger craft brewers pasteurizing those particular beers. So whether it's pasteurized or not, the next step is packaging. This is where we're putting the beer into a bottle or a can or a keg. So there's a process that many brewers undergo that we call bottle conditioning, where right before packaging, brewers will put a little bit of yeast and a little bit of sugar back into the beer right before packaging. And then that package, those bottles, are then held at stored in the warehouse for usually a couple weeks, and it's stored at fermentation temperature. So a secondary fermentation takes place in the bottle. And the reason why they do this goes back to that first step of fermentation that I referred to before with the oxygen. Oxygen, remember, is a nutrient for yeast. Well, after fermentation, oxygen is actually now the enemy of beer. And we're going to talk about that in the next talk. But oxygen is the enemy of beer now, and it will cause the beer to stale prematurely if you have high levels of it. So if we can promote a secondary fermentation in the bottle, then the yeast will take up any oxygen that's in the beer and use it for a nutrient, instead of allowing that oxygen to stale the beer later on. So in essence, bottle conditioning gives you a longer shelf life on your beer because it reduces oxygen. So there are a lot of bottle conditioned beers out there. There are some can conditioned beers out there, and some breweries, not as many, but some breweries even keg condition their beer. So that is the end of my description of the brewing process. I'm going to go into a list of questions that I've had a few coming in already. I'm going to go ahead and try and get to those. Before I get to those questions, I want to refer you to a link that is going to be posted here shortly, if not already. This is where a link will come up for the certified beer server exam. There it is. I see it in the chat right now. Click that link, fill out the survey, and that will enter you to win one of 10 certified beer server exams. Do it soon, because that link isn't going to be open forever. So it's going to be open for about an hour and a half. It's going to close at 3 o'clock Central. You've got an hour and a half to click on that link. So when this video closes, this video will live on our YouTube channel. So the link to that questionnaire will be posted in the description of this video. So you have until 3 o'clock to fill that out. All right, let's get to some questions. Let's see what we've got. Would you say that bottle re-fermenting keeps the beer quality? Well, yeah, I think this question came in before. I've talked about bottle conditioning, and yes, bottle conditioning, or as the person asking the question mentioned, bottle re-fermenting, I guess is another way of putting it. That bottle conditioning improves quality because it gives a longer shelf life. It helps to stave off the staling reactions that happen in beer. Does pasteurization change flavor in any way? So I think the short answer is yes, but to the degree that it changes the flavor is going to depend on a number of factors. So anytime you heat beer up to a high temperature, like you do in pasteurization, you're going to be accelerating the aging process of beer. We'll talk about that in the next session a little bit more detail. But by accelerating that aging, there is the potential of shortening the shelf life slightly. Now, with some beers, this might be a bigger deal than others, but there is the potential for some flavor change there. Where in the process do brewers add lactose to the brew? That's a good question. Lactose is a unfermentable milk sugar that's added for certain styles of beer, particularly a milk stout. There's a lot of newer styles that have lactose added. I know they're added to certain IPAs and sour beers now, and it's used in a lot of different ways. It's an unfermentable sugar that's added on the hot side, typically in the boil. So it dissolves completely in the wort, and then it's not fermented by the yeast, so it remains behind, and it makes the beer sweeter. What is the taste of DMS? The taste of DMS is a vegetal type of taste. It smells and tastes like, people will describe it as being like corn or cooked corn or vegetal. Does it color your beer? No, it does not. And how do you ensure that you don't get DMS in your final beer? So there's a compound that produces DMS that we get naturally in malt. Some lighter roasts of malt, like Pilsner malt, for example, have high levels of this precursor. So beers based in Pilsner malt can have a tendency to have more DMS, and it can be harder to get rid of. And some styles, it is an acceptable flavor in low levels. Sometimes it can be a difficult thing to completely get rid of, but the most effective way to reduce DMS is to get a good, vigorous rolling boil of your wort on the brew house. What is the difference between adding sugar or yeast in bottling? Well, they're two totally different things, but they're both necessary to produce bottle conditioning in the beer. So bottle conditioning is that re-fermentation in the package. And in order to have that, we need to have both sugar and yeast. So they're going to work in conjunction with each other. If we just add one or the other, we're not going to really have the desired effect. What flavors can ale yeasts produce other than esters and phenols during fermentation, please? So one particular compound that can be produced is something called diacetyl. Diacetyl is a compound that tastes like butter or butterscotch, and it's usually a very undesirable character in beer. And so yeast produces it naturally during fermentation, and then at the end of the fermentation, during the maturation period, it will actually reprocess that diacetyl. So diacetyl spikes during fermentation, and then it drops back down when the yeast processes it. So that's another of many different compounds that yeast can produce, but a very important one. What about open air fermentation, cool ships? So open fermenters can impart different qualities. So there's all kinds of different dynamics that can take place in fermentation, depending on the size and the shape of the fermenter and whether it's open or whether it's closed. And these different dynamics can work with different strains of yeast to produce different aromatics in beer. It can affect how quickly how quickly fermentation takes place, how much stress the yeast is under, and this can affect how much ester production there is. It can affect all kinds of different things. So, you know, there's a whole that's a whole separate discussion of shape and size and the type of fermenter. Now, a coolship, which you asked about, is a separate vessel for lambic production. We'll get into that in one of the later sessions on Belgian beer. But a coolship is essentially a giant, shallow, open vessel that's used for helping to cool the wort. And if it sits in there long enough, it picks up wild yeast and bacteria, which can affect the flavor of the beer. So we'll get into that more when we get into Belgian beers. How does bottle conditioning impact flavor? Well, so there's a couple ways it can impact flavor. One is through a slight increase in CO2. Some beers that undergo significant bottle conditioning, it increases carbon dioxide quite a bit. And it has an accompanying alcohol increase as well. So that's one major way you could do it. And just by the nature of it undergoing that fermentation, you've got you could potentially have more esters produced, more aromatic compounds. It really depends on the type of bottle conditioning yeast you're using, though. The biggest flavor impact is that it staves off some of the off flavors that develop over time as beer ages. How do breweries know how much sugar and yeast to add? Well, there's some calculations that brewers have. So if they have a fully fermentable sugar, they know how much to add and to achieve a certain amount of fermentation. So there's some calculations that brewers have that allow them to measure very specifically what to put in. What is wet hopping and how is it different from dry hopping? This is a good question because these can be some kind of confusing terms. So dry hopping, if you remember I mentioned earlier, that's the process of taking hops and putting them in the fermenter to give you additional aroma. Wet hopping isn't so much a process as it's describing how we're receiving the hops, the form of the hops. So hops, after they're harvested, those flowers are what we call wet. So it's a moist plant like any other plant. So before they're packaged and sent to breweries, in order to preserve them, they're dried. So the dried flowers are then packed into bales or they're processed into pellets. So during harvest season, some breweries will contract directly with hop growers to get the hops, those hop flowers, before they're dried. And so those hops are shipped directly to the brewer from the grower in their wet form. So you have these flowers straight off the vine, and then they're used in the brewing process. So those wet hops can be used in the boil, but they're more traditionally and more often than not, they're used in the dry hopping process. So that is what most people are referring to when they talk about wet hopping. It's using wet hops in the dry hopping process. So I realize those terms can be a little confusing. Again, wet hops refers to the hop itself before it's been dried by the grower. Dry hopping is a process whereby the brewer is putting hops in the fermenter for additional aroma. What is a bright tank? So a bright tank is a tank that holds the filtered beer ready for packaging. So brewers filter into the bright tank and then they package out of the bright tank. So whatever is in a bright tank should be ready to drink. It's just not in the package yet. How do you induce bottle conditioning? Well, inducing bottle conditioning, again, is just putting yeast and sugar into the package and then holding it at fermentation temperature. And when yeast is in the right conditions, it's going to go to work and it's going to eat sugar and create alcohol and CO2. Can you clarify? I'm a little confused with hops added for bitterness and hops added for aroma and flavor, when bitter is one of the 6 tastes part of flavor. That's a good question. So we talk about hops adding bitterness, and yes, bitterness is one of the basic tastes. But then when we refer to aroma and flavor with hops, we're talking about what we're getting from the hop oils. So those are the aromatics that might be citrusy, piney, or tropical fruit, or herbal, or whatever. Those aromas translate into flavor. If you remember the first session, we talked about how aroma and flavor are so closely linked, and you mentioned that in your question. So by talking about aroma and flavor hops, the flavor we're referring to there is that translation of the aroma, not the same flavor as the bitterness. So we've got the bitterness, and then we've got the aroma. And when we talk about aroma and flavor together, that flavor is referring back to what we're getting from the hop oils, those aromatics. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. How many days does it take to brew regular beer on average? So that's a good question. I didn't really mention fermentation time. If we're making ales, fermentation takes about 6 to 7 days in the vessel. So that's in addition to the 7 or so hours on the brew house, right? So you've got about maybe 7 days, and it depends on the beers. Some of them have a little bit longer maturation. Some ales might undergo a day or 2 of maturation phase. So it could be anywhere from 6 to maybe 9 or 10 days potentially. Lager beers take longer. We've got about 2 weeks for fermentation, and then they could age or undergo, not necessarily, didn't mean to say age, but more mature. They undergo that maturation phase, that lagering, for an extended period of time. And again, this is going to depend on the brewer. That maturation could be several weeks. So lager beers can take a month or more in the tank sometimes. What temperature range is the wort cooled to during fermentation phase? So for ales, we're looking at somewhere typically in the around room temperature, roughly. So we're looking kind of in the 60s to upper 60s, maybe low 70s range for fermentation temperature. This is going to depend on the brewer. It's going to depend on the strain of yeast and what the brewer is trying to achieve and the type of beer. So this can have a pretty big range. Lager beer is going to be a little colder. It might be upper 40s, low 50s. Double dry hop. Is double dry hop double the hops used in the boil or double the hops used during dry hopping? Well, so if they're saying dry hop and they're saying they're using double, then I would say they're referring to how much hops they're putting in the fermenter, because that's the dry hopping process. And a term like double dry hop is, could mean any number of different things depending on who's saying it. Brewers say a lot of things and they use a lot of marketing terms that don't necessarily refer directly back to a one set thing on the brew house. It can mean any number of different things depending on who's saying it. Can you explain the terms fermentation versus maturation? Are those the same things, or does the brew mature after fermentation? Well, you're right. Maturation is considered to be part of the fermentation phase. So the yeast is still active. So there's there's the main fermentation. The yeast will eat oxygen, then it eats sugars, and then it goes through a maturation phase. So that all takes place in the fermenter. Okay, well, that looks like the end of the questions I've got for right now. So that's it for today. Make sure you join me next Tuesday, May 5th, for the next CBS Prep Talk. That's CBS Prep Talk number 5, oxidation and light struck off flavors. So that should be a fun topic. We're going to talk about that next Tuesday, same time, same place, 1 p.m. Central Time. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to the YouTube channel and get more cool Cicerone content. I will see you here next Tuesday. Thanks for joining, everybody. See you later.